where does this 10,000 steps come from? And more importantly, does it matter? How many steps should we be shooting for?
Welcome to a Healthy Control podcast, providing education to create a healthy, balanced lifestyle, empowering you to take control of your health and not let health take control of you. The concept of 10,000 steps per day originated in Japan in the 1960s. Because I don't speak Japanese very well and I'm just pretty bad with language anyways, I apologize that I'm going to mispronounce half of this stuff. But there was a pedometer company called Yasama and developed the Menpo Kai, which translates when pronounced correctly to 10,000 steps meter. So essentially it was a group of marketers who changed the history of physical activity. I don't know, maybe they did their research and they came to some conclusion that 10,000 steps is what was needed, or maybe it was just a nice round even number. Fortunately, in the last 60 years, we have some research behind this, and we figured out just how many steps per day do we actually need. I believe it's important to remember where we came from. And when we think about in this context, being hunters and gatherers thousands and thousands of years ago, they were constantly on the move, whether they're looking for animals or berries or even just water. They were constantly walking, and it's estimated they moved about 17,000 steps per day or 8 miles. So that's well far beyond the 10,000 steps recommended today. Also back then, cardiovascular disease was essentially unheard of. Now there is a little asterisk above this because maybe they died from other things like, I don't know, being attacked by an animal or freezing to death or the flu or common cold. Things that we typically don't have to worry about today's day and age. But it's estimated they had far less cardiovascular issues than we do. It was also estimated that their lifespan was about 30 years old. However, they had a super high mortality of the infants and very, very young, which kind of shifts that number down quite a bit. So when you eliminate those, people lived into their 50s or 60s. And even in my own family line, we've had people suffer from heart attacks before the age of 60 and even at the age of 50. So I do think there's a correlation there, the amount of walking and steps per day to your cardiovascular health. And yes, our diets are extremely different now than they were way back then. Looking at this first study from 2019, the modern day paleo diet, which worded that way feels kind of silly because modern day and paleo was a long time ago. But anyways, this study was a meta-analysis of 8 controlled trials, and a meta-analysis is essentially taking the work that others produced and coming to a conclusion off those. So it looks at 8 studies and then it puts them all together and comes to a conclusion there. And then a randomized controlled trial is generally good quality research in terms of having a control group when applicable, blind testers. It's more than just observing something or an anecdote or just a story. And they found a statistical decrease in cardiovascular disease markers and that the paleo diet has a favorable effect on cardiovascular disease. But they did conclude that the evidence is not conclusive and more studies will be needed. Which in most research, it usually ends with something of, oh, we also need to go look at this or that. However, it is good to see that this diet can help with cardiovascular disease. But anyways, back to the step count. Yes, their diet probably helped them, but also the amount that they were walking also probably helped quite a bit. I get it though. 8 miles per day. Just simply not feasible for everyone. The average person gets about 4,000 or 5,000 steps a day, which is about 2 miles. So a quarter of what they were doing back then. It's hard to go from 2 to 8 miles. Especially when you think about a leisure walking pace is 30 minutes for a mile. Do you have an extra 3 hours in your day just to go get that extra 6 miles to walk? I know I don't. I do not have an extra 3 hours a day to go walk enough. Or if you want to get up to 10,000 steps, that would be another 2 miles. So what is that, 2 extra hours a day? I know I do not have 2 hours a day to go walking. And that can just seem very defeating. Here's my goal. It seems impossible for me to get up to that extra. I just simply don't have the time. What can we do? Remember, this all depends on whether or not 10,000 steps is actually the right amount. And we're going to get into that after this break.
Hey, it's me. So this is the part of the podcast where there's usually a sponsor, and I don't know if you know this, but you are actually our first sponsor. And you can do that by liking and subscribing to the podcast, to your YouTube channel, or even both. That would be awesome.
There was a study done in the Journal of American Medical Association, which is a pretty good journal, and it was looking to answer our very question: how many steps per day are needed? And I think it's important to understand exactly why we need steps. As alluded to earlier, it has a significant decrease in mortality rate, or the chance of passing away. So this study was born back in 2019, and it looked at 17,000 women, average age of 72. They counted their steps for a 7-day period and then followed up with them 4 months later. They also looked at height and weight and smoking status, alcohol use, postmenopausal hormone health, self-rated health, hypertension, high cholesterol, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer, cancer screening, and family medical history. Diet was also measured on a 131-item food frequency questionnaire. So yes, much more than just steps, but steps is a part of it, and it's part of the big picture here. They found that the sedentary person, the sedentary 72-year-old woman, took about 2,700 steps per day. Increasing that just to 4,400, so adding just 1,700 steps per day, decreased their mortality rate by 41%. And there was a progressive decline in mortality rate all the way up to 7,500 steps per day. Now let's break this down just a little bit more. And how can we make this applicable to everyone, or what are the limitations here? I don't know about you, but I am not a 72-year-old woman. Surprise. There's still things that the rest of us can take from it, and that it's more walking is probably better than less. It's also fair to say that there's probably some cutoff point in this study for these women, happen to be 7,500 steps. But maybe as you get older, or if you're a male versus female, maybe that number's different. And we just don't know because the study did not look into that. But it's just something to think about, that there is a time and there is a step count where enough is enough. And for me, that's comforting knowing that when I have a ambiguous goal of just as many steps as possible, that can get really out of hand. And there's never that satisfaction of I did it. When you have a 10,000 step count and your watch goes off because you hit 10,000, that's a good feeling. It's like, yes, success. But if that number is unlimited, it's like, man, I never feel like I did good enough. So it's nice knowing that at some point enough is enough, and maybe that's 7,500, maybe that's 10,000, maybe that's 15,000, and maybe it all depends on how old you are. But I think the important thing to realize here is that if you're on that lower end of the scale, if you're at that 2,700 steps per day, even 4,000, let's try to get that a little bit higher, because it can go a long way by just adding 1,000 steps. And if you're in America, it's relatively easy to count your steps. It's estimated 1/5 of Americans wear a smartwatch, which going to count your steps, and about 85% of adults have a smartphone, which can also track your steps. And then for people who cannot track your steps, walking 1 mile is roughly 30 minutes, so that can give you a pretty rough estimate of how much am I walking throughout the day. And I think it's fair to ask ourselves, are our watches and phones even accurate? If you're only tracking your steps through your phone, but your phone's not with you for 3/4 of the day, that's not accurate. I know plenty of times I've left my phone upstairs on the couch or in the couch, and it's missing for an hour or two, so my phone's not going to track any of my steps. So we looked at the study here that has 5 watches and want to see how accurate the step count was in those watches. And in general, they're pretty good, within 10%. So, I'm happy if I'm within 10% of all my steps being counted. However, let's just pivot here to calorie count on these watches, because I think that is important as well and could be its own episode, but we're going to do a little deep dive here, just a mini one. If your watch is counting your steps within 10% accuracy, how accurate do you think it is within counting your calories burned per day? Well, with this study, we found that our smartwatches are just not smart enough. To cite this study, 13 to 60%, that's 13 to 60% was the difference between actual calories burned and what the watch said was burned. And some watches overestimated and some underestimated. So we can't even just say, yeah, take that number and subtract 20% or whatever. They're all over the place. Future tech may be better, but where we're at right now is watches and phones good enough to count your steps, inaccurate in a wildly way that just don't even trust it for counting your calories. So if you're like me and you don't have an extra 2 or 3 hours in the day to just go walk, that's fine. That is completely fine. We're going to go through some strategies here on how you can easily add steps in the day without even really realizing it. First one, for those who have to drive to work or drive to the store, just park farther away. Park in the back. If it's safe, park farther away. My wife is notorious for this, and when it's a cold, rainy day, kind of a pain in the butt. But she's doing us both a favor because she's always parking in the very back. I actually tested this recently, and it was something like 200 or 300 extra steps I got because I parked way in the back. Another thing you can do is get up more at work. We are driven by technology these days. And if you're in an office and you send an email to somebody, could you have just gone and walked and talked to them? Don't get me wrong, I am a huge advocate of having a paper trail because I will forget things if it's not written down. That's fine. You can still send an email afterwards saying, hey, just to recap our meeting, blah, blah, blah. But go and walk and talk to this person. You'll get, 100 extra steps from that. And if you got to talk to enough people, that can add up over a day, over a week, over a year. For good work ergonomics and posture, for every 30 minutes we're at work or sitting, 8 of those should actually be standing, and 2 of those should actually be walking. It's called the 2-8-20 rule. Very inventive. For every 30 minutes, you sit for 20, you stand for 8, and you walk for 2. And I promise you, taking that 2-minute break 14 times a day is not going to ruin your productivity at work. It's actually going to improve it. Many studies have shown that just taking these micro working breaks make us more productive when we come back because we are not made to be nose in the computer for 8 straight hours. Last piece of advice here, a desk treadmill at work. Now this treadmill is kind of cool. It's a treadmill and it has a desk on top of it so you can stand and walk at the same time. Maybe your work setup just doesn't even allow it. Understandable. Maybe you work at home and this is something you could implement tomorrow. And from the British Journal of Sports Medicine, which is a highly touted journal, there was a study that looked at energy expenditure of people sitting with a desk treadmill or just sitting. The treadmill helped participants burn almost 300 calories per hour more than just sitting, which is a significant amount. Another study over a 12-month span saw participants increase their activity units by roughly 25% per day, and it did not negatively affect their work performance. Maybe a treadmill doesn't work for you, but there's these under-the-desk bikes, just little pedals that you can work on, and that's going to help you get moving as well. There are plenty of instances, and I bet if you just took some time, you could find ways that you can walk just a little bit further. One last bonus one. Next time you watch TV, don't use a remote. If you have 300 channels, you might be there a while pushing that button on the TV to get to the next channel. My challenge for you is this. Increase your step count. If you're at 2,000, let's get to 4,000. If you're at 4,000, maybe 8,000. Pick a number that you realistically can achieve and adjust your lifestyle to make it work. So while there is no perfect number, 10,000 seems good, 7,500 also seems good. There's no perfect number, but we do know that more is better than less. And research shows again and again that walking can improve cardiovascular health, reduce the risk of chronic disease like obesity and diabetes, and can enhance your mental well-being. It's also a low-impact activity that's accessible to almost everybody. I want to leave you with this to ponder on. And I wish I could take credit for it, but I've heard it a few different places, and even this study today said it too. If exercise was a pill, it would be the number 1 prescribed medication, and second place would not even be close.
Thank you for listening to A Healthy Control podcast. You can find us at YouTube at A Healthy Control and make sure to subscribe. You can also reach me at ahealthycontrol@gmail.com with any comments or questions you'd like answered on the show. Reminder, A Healthy Control podcast is for entertainment purposes only and not in lieu of any medical advice. If you have any concerns about your health, please speak to a healthcare provider.